Okay, so here we look at frequency distributions. We're going to think about how to create a measure from these. So we look at these different countries. The more spread out the distribution is, the more unequal they are. And the more tightly together the distribution is, the more equal they are. One thing you can notice, for example, Tanzania, the distribution is not so spread out. Most of the bulk of the is right there together. And then there's a few people far away. But people are sort of equally poor. Again, these numbers are quite old, like Vietnam, 1998. Vietnam's nowhere close to this level of income now, although it's still fairly um, has a fairly low level of inequality. And we can see Nicaragua, for example, when compared to Tanzania, has a higher average income, but it's also more spread out, right? Albania also has a way higher average income and is a little more spread out compared to Tanzania or Vietnam. But they're not so easy to compare like this. And if we're trying to compare for all the countries in the world, this would be super inconvenient. Okay, so we're going to look at a few different ways, and then I'll make sure I tell you what our primary way is going to be. But I'm going to introduce to you a few different ideas about how to measure inequality. So one of the earliest ways to measure inequality was something called the Kuznets ratio. Okay, so Simon Kuznets came up with this, I believe, in the 1950s. And his was just, well, a simple idea, really simple, but it's going to give you a single number. How much income was received by the top 20% compared to how much income was received by the bottom 40%. Okay? And I think in his original paper, he actually used 60% for the bottom, but most papers now use, when they're talking about the Kuznets ratio, they use 40%. Okay, so this was his idea, and so the higher this is, then that means the more unequal it is, because the wealthy group is receiving the biggest amount. Okay, compare relative to the bottom 40%. So this is a very rough measure of inequality. It's not particularly good as a measure of inequality because it's so rough. So it wouldn't measure small changes. For example, in the bottom 40%, it's not going to be able to distinguish between a situation where it's pretty equally distributed amongst that group, or versus a situation where the bottom 10% get almost nothing, and the one that's right at the edge of the 40% gets a lot. It can't distinguish between those kind of differences. So anyways, but it's something that was used historically, and it's interesting because there was a certain hypothesis generated from this idea that is still with us today, and that's pretty interesting. So when we do calculation problems, I will have you calculate the Kuznets ratio just out of interest, but we will mostly use different methods. Okay, what's the Kuznets hypothesis? Well, this is different countries around the world. Again, this data is a little bit old, but that doesn't really matter. Countries around the world, and so the bottom black dots are countries for what percentage of income is taken by the poorest 40% of the society, or the 40% with the lowest incomes, right? That's this line down here, and this line is sort of fitted through these, okay? And then the richest 20%, what share of income do they take? So and then of course the Kuznets ratio would be the ratio between these. So how many times bigger is the top one compared to the bottom one? Okay, that's the Kuznets ratio. So there's something you kind of notice here is Kuznets saw a relationship in the data. And this relationship was that it seems like, so you can kind of think as the further apart they become, then the bigger the ratio is getting. Okay, the more unequal things are, the further apart. And the closer together they get, when they get close together, then it's getting more equal. So it looks like for the poor countries, as they go to middle income, it looks like, well, inequality gets worse. The income share, this is not, again, this is not the total income. This is the income share. Okay, so this is the income share, not the total income. So the poor in the middle income countries on average still have more than the poor in the poor countries, because in absolute terms. But their share of the total income, it looks like, shrinks a little bit. And it looks like the top 20% group, their income share grows a little bit in the middle. And then it looks like this improves as these countries go towards being wealthy countries. At least that's what it looks like when we look at a cross-section of countries. So that's the Kuznets hypothesis. That Kuznets hypothesis is that income inequality worsens as countries go into middle income, and then tends to improve as they reach high income. So initially, the capitalists and the people with education and such, they grow more. But eventually, there's some catch-up going on. And so in the end, in the wealthy countries, we should end up, this hypothesis is we would end up with still some inequality, but not as bad as in the middle. But there's some big caveats here. So that maybe this is not true. And so this is, I'm not going to give you a final answer on this because this has been debated for decades and there is really no final answer on which one is true. But the caveats are, many of these countries are in Latin America. And that Latin America has historically high levels of inequality for several historical reasons, which I will get into at the end of the unit. But one of them is the way land was distributed, and the other one is there's also large divides along ethnic lines in many Latin American countries for historical reasons. So, for example, indigenous groups, which are somewhat restricted, or maybe restricted is not the right word, but there's disadvantage, I guess is the word. So anyways, that's part of it. So Latin America is very unequal compared to other regions of the world on average. And and Latin American countries also just happen to be middle income countries. So there may be that this is not, if you take those out, this relationship disappears to some extent. The second thing is this is not deterministic. So it does, although you see this on average when you look across countries, it is not deterministic, meaning it is not guaranteed that as countries move from being poor countries to middle income countries that inequality gets worse. It's also definitely not guaranteed that as they get richer that it will get better. You can think of the US. The US income inequality has become significantly worse since the 1970s, even during a time when the US economy has grown quite a bit. Okay, so it's definitely not deterministic that every country would follow this kind of pattern. Okay, in our next video, then we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of which measures we're actually going to use. So the next video will be more of a kind of a numerical example type of video.